One of these shows already knew its lead would be gunned down on a rooftop in 1993, years before it wrote a single line. The other could send its lead anywhere it wished, slowly turning a quiet teacher into a monster on its own schedule. That single gap explains almost everything. Breaking Bad and Narcos are both brilliant shows about the drug trade. People rightly love them both. So why does one of them leave the other far behind on pure writing? The whole answer comes down to one word: freedom. Breaking Bad was free to invent every single moment, and it used that freedom three ways: total control over its made-up world, buried clues that paid off years later, and an ending it got to design down to the second. Narcos, chained to real history, could never do the same. Across both shows, scene by scene and season by season, the proof is overwhelming. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let us begin. Section 1. One story was free, the other was trapped. Two shows about the drug world arrived within a few years of each other, and both turned into giants. Breaking Bad ran on the channel AMC from 2008 to 2013. Narcos landed on Netflix in 2015. Both follow men who build empires out of selling drugs. Both are dark. Both are clever. Both still pull in new fans every single year. Side by side, they can look like close cousins, two crime stories told with skill and nerve. The difference that truly matters, the one that decides everything else, comes down to one plain question: who got to choose what happened next? On Breaking Bad, the people writing the show could choose anything at all. On Narcos, they could not. That single gap sits under every other point in this whole video, and it deserves a careful look. Walter White did not exist before Breaking Bad. He was made up out of thin air. A writer named Vince Gilligan imagined him, then handed him over to a small team of other writers to raise together. Walter begins the show as a high school chemistry teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He is quiet and tired and badly underpaid. He is the sort of man a crowd walks straight past. Then a doctor tells him he has lung cancer, and something in him snaps awake. He decides to start cooking meth, a powerful and illegal drug, so he can leave a pile of money behind for his wife and son before he dies. Gilligan knew where this man was headed from the very first day. He summed up the whole show in one short, now famous line. He wanted to take a kind and gentle teacher, the type from an old film called Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and slowly turn him into a cold and ruthless criminal, the type from the film Scarface. Mr. Chips becomes Scarface. That was the entire pitch. That was the map the writers carried in their pockets for 5 seasons, and it pointed in only one direction: downward, into the dark. Here is the gift hidden inside that map: complete control. The writers got to pick the exact hour when Walter stopped being a decent man. They got to set the speed of his fall and the depth of it. Nothing out in the real world told them what Walter had to do or when, because Walter was never real. Every step he took into darkness was a step a writer chose for him, on purpose, for a reason. That kind of power is rare, and Breaking Bad used it better than almost any show before it. The sharpest proof of that power comes in the second half of Season 2. By then, Walter has a partner, a jumpy young former student named Jesse Pinkman. Jesse has fallen hard for a woman named Jane. Jane is sharp and funny, and she is in recovery from heroin, until the two of them end up using together. She has also seen that Walter is dangerous, and she pushes Jesse to break away from him and take the money he is owed. In an episode called Phoenix, near the end of the season, Jane turns into a problem Walter would very much like to disappear. Then comes the moment the whole show seems to turn on. Walter walks over to Jesse's place to check on him after a fight. He finds Jesse and Jane in bed, both knocked out cold from the drugs. As Walter moves to wake Jesse, Jane rolls onto her back in her sleep and begins to choke. She is throwing up and cannot wake herself, and she is starting to die right there. Walter lunges forward to flip her onto her side, the small, easy move that would save her in a heartbeat. His hand almost touches her, and then he freezes. He pulls back. He stands and watches her die. The way that scene is built is the reason it cuts so deep. No big, loud music swells up to tell the crowd how to feel. The room stays dim and quiet. The camera holds steady on Walter's face and refuses to look away. His eyes travel from sudden panic to a flicker of thought, to a terrible kind of calm. He could end her choking in 2 seconds flat. He chooses, with full knowledge, to do nothing. The actor, Bryan Cranston, carries the whole thing with barely a word. Just a face doing quiet, awful math. One tear slides down. The show does not hurry past the choice or try to soften it. It simply holds and lets the worst thing Walter has done so far hang in the open air. What that moment really tells the audience is that a line has been crossed for good. Before this, Walter has hurt people, but almost always in a panic, or to keep himself alive, or in a fight he did not start. Letting Jane die is something colder. He has time to think, and he uses that time to decide her death helps him. She stood in his way, so he let her slip out of the world. The shy teacher from the first episode would never have done it. The writers placed that turn exactly where they wanted it, at the close of a season, just before the rest of Walter's world cracks apart. Years later, fans still circle back to that scene as the night Walter truly broke bad. It comes up over and over in long talks about the show, named again and again as the point where the kind teacher vanished and never came back. The writers did not trip and fall into that moment by luck. They aimed at it across a whole season and landed it on the mark. And the only reason they could aim at all is that they owned Walter completely, body and soul, from his first scene to his last. Narcos lives in the opposite world. Its center for the first 2 seasons is Pablo Escobar, and Pablo Escobar was a real man. He was a Colombian drug lord who rose to become one of the richest and most feared criminals the world has ever seen. He ran the Medellin cartel, a giant business built on selling cocaine. He bribed judges, bought police, blew up planes and buildings, and held an entire country in a grip of fear for years. Then, on a rooftop in the city of Medellin in December of 1993, soldiers who had hunted him for ages finally caught up, and he was shot and killed. That last fact shapes the writing more than anything else. Escobar's death was never something the show could decide. It was already done. It happened in a set way, on a set day, and millions of people around the world knew the ending long before the first scene was ever filmed. The writers of Narcos sat down to tell a story whose very last moment was set in stone before they typed a single word. They could choose how to walk up to that ending. They could never choose the ending itself. The show reaches that locked ending at the close of season 2. Escobar, cornered and nearly alone, scrambles across the rooftops of a calm, middle-class neighborhood as armed men close in from every side. Gunfire cracks. He drops onto the clay roof tiles, bleeding, and dies out there under the open sky. The show even copies the exact look of the real day. There is a well-known true photograph of Escobar's body lying on a rooftop, ringed by the men who finally got him. And Narcos rebuilds that picture, almost frame for frame. Matching history that closely takes real skill. It calls for careful research, a sharp eye, and respect for the facts. But that same care points straight at the cage the writers were living in. The single biggest moment of the first 2 seasons, the death of the main character, was written by real life and simply handed over. The team could shift small details around the edges. They could not touch the core of it. Escobar had to die, on a rooftop, shot by the men chasing him, because that is the way it truly went. The writers spent that ending following a path real life had already carved, with little room to carve their own. Even the actor who played him said as much in plain words. Wagner Moura, the Brazilian actor behind Escobar, explained that the show was never really built to be about Escobar as a person in the first place. In his telling, the real subject was the birth of the whole drug trade, and Escobar was simply the doorway into it. The cocaine wars were the room. That is a clever way to handle a true story, but it also lays the limit bare. The writers could not dive deep into one man's heart and bend it to their will, because the man belonged to the history books, not to them. Seen from a distance, the gap shows up in what each show is even trying to do at its core. Breaking Bad runs on choice. Its whole engine is a man deciding, again and again, to become worse, with every safer door left wide open beside him. To tell that story, the writers needed full freedom, because the freedom is the story. Walter chooses his own way into the dark. He walks there on his own 2 feet, and the writers walk him there, one careful step at a time. Take away their control, and the entire point would fall apart. Narcos runs on record instead. Its job is to show what already took place, then dress those real events in drama so a huge crowd will sit down and watch and learn. There is honest worth in that. Plenty of viewers picked up the rough shape of the cocaine wars from this very show, having known almost nothing before. Yet showing what happened and inventing what could happen are 2 wildly different jobs. They ask for different gifts and reward different kinds of writing. One job hunts for shape and surprise. The other guards truth and gets the details right. One more thing hides inside this difference, and it is easy to miss. Because Breaking Bad could shape its man so freely, it could quietly turn him into a test for the people watching. Crowds kept cheering for Walter long after he stopped earning a single cheer, and the show pulled that off on purpose, by deciding with great care how much to reveal and when to reveal it. Narcos could never run that same trick on Escobar. Everyone already knew how his story ended, and what kind of man he had been in life. His fall surprised no one. It sat in history books, waiting, while the show simply walked toward it. This is the deep root of the whole argument. When people say Breaking Bad is better written than Narcos, they usually point at sharp scenes, or clever lines, or twists that knocked them flat. All of that is fair. But the reason underneath all of it is quieter and stronger. The writers of Breaking Bad held a blank page. The writers of Narcos held a true story. A blank page can be folded into any shape a mind can dream up. A true story can only be traced over, line by line. Both take talent, yet only one lets a writer design the perfect fall and then deliver it, step by step, right on time. That is why the comparison stays fair, even though the 2 shows sit so close in subject. They were never playing the same game on the same field. Breaking Bad picked a game it could win cleanly, and that pick was itself a piece of smart writing, made before a single episode aired. Freedom on the page, though, is only worth something when a writer knows exactly what to do with it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And this is where Breaking Bad pulls even further out in front. That same freedom let its writers attempt something Narcos never had the room to even try. They buried small, strange clues deep in the early hours of the show, and then left them alone, untouched and unexplained, building piece by piece before the trap finally snapped shut. The next part follows one of those buried clues, a burned, pink, one-eyed toy floating in a backyard pool, and how it quietly warned, week after week, of a disaster the writers had planned long before it ever landed. Section 2. A burned toy and a promise kept. Total control over a made-up man does not turn into great television all by itself. A writer still has to know what to do with all that freedom. The last part showed that the people behind Breaking Bad could send Walter White anywhere they pleased, because he was theirs to move. This part shows the smartest thing they did with that power. They learned to hide a small clue early in the show, leave it sitting in plain sight, and then pay it back much later with a blow that hurt all the more because the setup had been quietly waiting the whole time. The trick has a simple shape. Drop something odd into an early scene. Do not explain it. Let it sit there, strange and unfinished, while the story rolls on and the viewer half forgets it was ever there. Then, later, when the moment is right, snap the trap shut and reveal what that odd little thing was for. Done well, the payoff feels both shocking and fair at once, because the clue was always sitting in the open. A show can only pull this off if it knows its own future down to the smallest detail. Breaking Bad knew. Season 2 carries the clearest example of all. 4 times across that year, the show opens not with Walter or Jesse, but with a quiet, eerie scene drained of nearly all color. Everything is black and white, except for one thing. A small pink teddy bear, burned along one side and missing an eye, floats face down in the still water of a backyard pool. The first time, that is almost all the audience gets. The bear, the water, the silence. No words, no explanation. Just a heavy sense that something awful has happened, or is about to. Each time the show returns to that pool, it gives a little more. In one opening, workers in white safety suits move slowly through the yard, fishing things out of the water and sealing them inside clear plastic bags. In another, the camera pulls back to show body bags laid out in a neat, terrible row on the ground. By the last of these scenes, the full picture finally arrives. Walter stands in his own backyard, staring up at the sky as broken pieces rain down around him. The pink bear is one of those pieces. It has fallen from high above. What fell from the sky was a plane. 2 of them, in fact, that smashed into each other far above the city of Albuquerque, broke apart, and killed more than 100 people in the air. The wreckage scattered for miles, and some of it came down right over Walter's house. The burned little bear that had been floating in his pool for an entire season was a toy from that crash, carried down out of the clouds along with the dead. The thing the show had been teasing in cold, colorless flashes was a disaster of enormous size. The way the writers planned this is almost playful, in a grim way. Each of the 4 episodes that opened with the bear had a 1 or 2 word title that seemed to mean little on its own. 737, Down, Over, ABQ. Read alone, they are just scraps. Read in order, across the whole season, they spell out a single sentence. 737. Down. Over. A, B, Q. A type of plane going down over Albuquerque. The ending had been hiding in the names of the episodes the entire time, sitting in plain sight, waiting for anyone sharp enough to line them up. Notice what the show flatly refuses to do here. It never stops to spell any of this out while it is happening. No voice breaks in to warn that a crash is coming. No character points at the bear and explains what it stands for. The black and white drains the scenes of all comfort, and the single spot of pink yanks the eye straight to the toy. Yet the meaning is left for the viewer to build alone. The show plants the clue, steps back, and trusts the people watching to feel the full weight of it once the truth finally lands. Underneath the shock, the crash carries a far darker idea. And it ties straight back to the last part of this story. Consider who caused it. The two planes collided because the man guiding them through the sky made a deadly mistake. His job was to keep aircraft apart and safe, tracking them from a screen on the ground. And on that day, his mind was somewhere far away. That man was Jane's father. His daughter had just died, choking in her sleep, while Walter stood beside the bed and chose to do nothing and let her go. Trace the line, and it turns the blood cold. Walter let Jane die to protect himself. Jane's death shattered her father. Her shattered father, back at work far too soon and lost inside his grief, lined up two planes on the same path in the sky and could not pull them apart in time. More than 100 strangers fell out of the air. A child's toy drifted down into the killer's pool. One quiet, selfish choice in a single bedroom reached all the way up into the clouds and dragged down a disaster. The show drew that whole chain on purpose, link by link, across a full season. That is what the freedom from the last part actually buys. A made-up world lets writers build a clean line of cause and effect, where one small sin swells into a giant one through steps that all make sense. Every piece of that chain was set down by a writer who already knew exactly where it would end. The bear in the opening scene of the season only works because the crash in the closing scene was decided first. They wrote the ending, then went back to the beginning and buried the warning where almost no one would catch it the first time through. The bear did not stop mattering once the crash was explained. The show keeps holding on to it. Early in the next season, Walter finds the bear's missing eye stuck in the filter of his pool, fishes it out, and keeps it, slipping it into a drawer like a guilty secret he cannot bring himself to throw away. Around that same time, he stands in front of his son's entire school and gives a stumbling speech about the crash, trying to comfort the students while really only trying to soothe himself, never once admitting the part he played in setting it all in motion. The man who built the show, Vince Gilligan, has said the writers could not even fully agree on everything the bear was meant to stand for. But the one idea they all shared was judgment. The toy is a small, staring reminder that Walter's choices carry a cost, counted in human lives, and that someone, somewhere, is keeping score. Beyond the bear, the same habit turns up all over the show. Early in that very same second season, Walter and Jesse cook up a homemade poison, planning to use it on a man who wants them both dead. That plan falls apart, and the poison seems to slip out of the story for good. It does not. The writers tuck it away and keep it tucked, season after season, until the final hour of the entire series, when Walter at last puts it to use in a way almost no one saw coming. A weapon loaded in the second year does not fire until the closing minutes of the fifth. These are not lucky accidents. A show might stumble into one neat payoff by pure chance. A show does not stumble into dozens of them. Breaking Bad treated its own past as a promise it was bound to keep, circling back again and again to old objects, old lines, old choices, and handing each of them fresh weight. The people watching slowly learned to lean in and pay close attention, because they came to trust that nothing on this show was ever truly wasted. A small thing left in the corner of the screen might turn out to be a bomb with a very long fuse. Narcos works with setups too, since every story has to plant things it will later collect. But the way it goes about that could hardly be more different, and the difference flows straight out of the cage described in the last part. A true story, sprinting through nearly 20 years of real history, cannot easily bury a quiet clue and then wait 3 whole seasons to dig it back up. There is too much ground to cross and far too little room to sit and be patient. So Narcos reaches for a faster tool instead. That tool is the voice. Narcos is guided across almost its entire length by a narrator, an American agent who talks the audience through the story from the first scene to the last. When the show needs the viewer to hold on to someone for later, it does not hide a clue and hope the moment lands. It freezes the picture on a person's face and has the narrator say, in flat and simple words, that this man matters and will be back. The setup is handed over directly, spoken right out loud, with no waiting at all, and no work left for anyone watching to do. There is a real reason for that choice, and it is not laziness. A history this large and this fast needs a guide, or a fresh viewer would drown in names and dates inside the first 10 minutes. The narrator keeps everyone's head above water. Even so, every time the show pauses to point at something and explain why it matters, it quietly gives away a slice of the power that Breaking Bad chose to hold back. A clue the show tells the viewer to remember is not the same animal as a clue the viewer uncovers alone. One is a note handed over. The other is a secret cracked open. The first informs. The second rewards. The gap shows up most clearly in how the two shows treat the people sitting in front of them. Breaking Bad acts as though its audience is patient and sharp, glad to carry a strange image around in mind for weeks and to feel the jolt when it finally pays off. Narcos acts as though its audience needs a steady hand resting on the shoulder, a calm voice, making sure nobody wanders off and gets lost. Both choices fit the shows that made them. Only one of them, though, can build the slow, buried, season-long traps that fans still pull apart and admire many years afterward. This is where the freedom from the last part hardens into real skill on the page. Control of a made-up world is the door. Planting and payoff is what waits on the far side of it. The writers of Breaking Bad could promise, in the opening scene of a season, that a horror was on its way, and then keep that promise down to the exact second, because they owned every single moment in between. The writers of Narcos could not offer that kind of promise, because the moments in between already belonged to history. And history does not take requests or rewrites. None of this paints Narcos as careless or dull. Threading a real, tangled war into one clear story is hard and honest work, and the narrator is a fair answer to a genuine problem. The point here is narrower and a good deal sharper than that. In the slow art of setting a trap and springing it at the perfect instant, Breaking Bad simply had room to play that Narcos was never handed, and it used every inch of that room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same narrator, though, the voice that keeps Narcos afloat through all those years and names, is also one of the loudest complaints critics have ever aimed at the show. For plenty of them, that endless talking does not steer the story so much as bury it, telling the audience things the pictures could have shown far better on their own. The next part climbs inside that voice, follows just how much of the whole show is propped up on it, and asks a plain question about good storytelling that this comparison cannot dodge. Section 3. The show that talks and the show that shows. The last part ended on the voice that carries Narcos, the narrator who talks the audience through nearly 20 years of history. That voice deserves a closer look because it points to the oldest rule in all of storytelling and to the place where the two shows split most clearly. The rule is short. Show, do not tell. Let the pictures and the actions carry the meaning and trust the audience to feel it, instead of stopping the story to explain it in plain words. Breaking Bad follows that rule with iron discipline. Narcos breaks it on purpose, over and over, and the cost slowly piles up. Showing and telling are easy to feel apart and easy to mix up. Telling is when a story stops, and a voice explains what is happening, what it means, and how to feel about it. Showing is when the story simply puts the moment in front of the audience and lets them work it out alone. A man who is dangerous can be made dangerous in two ways on a screen. A voice can announce that he is feared and deadly, or he can walk into a room and do something that makes the air go cold, while nobody says a single word about how frightening he is. The second way is much harder to write. It also lands far deeper. Narcos leans on the first way for much of its length. For the first 2 seasons, the whole story is guided by a narrator named Steve Murphy, an American agent sent to Colombia to help hunt down Pablo Escobar. His voice runs over the top of the show almost without a break. He explains who the powerful families are. He fills in the dates, the deals, the betrayals, the body counts. He sets the scene, sums up the years, and tells the audience what to make of nearly everything on screen. When the 3rd season arrives and Murphy is gone, his partner Javier Peña simply picks up the same job, and the talking rolls on. A typical stretch of the show often runs in a clear shape. The narrator speaks for a long while over real footage or staged scenes, pouring out background and history. Then, a short scene plays where the characters react to that same information. The voice does the heavy lifting. The pictures mostly sit underneath the words, showing what the voice has already said. At times, the show even drops in real news clips from the era, with real reporters covering the real events, stitched in beside the made-up scenes. The history is handed over directly, in words, before the drama ever gets a chance to act it out. The clearest sign of this habit is a small move the show makes more than once. The action stops. The picture freezes on a single person's face, and the narrator tells the audience to take a good look, because this man will matter later. The setup could not be more open. There is no buried clue, no patient wait, no work left for anyone watching. The show points at the person and says, in effect, keep an eye on him. It is fast, it is clear, and it leaves nothing to chance. It also hands away the very thing that made the burned bear from the last part hit so hard. Audiences felt this, and so did the critics. The narrator became the single most common complaint aimed at Narcos, raised in review after review. One writer compared the experience to a dull man reading the online encyclopedia entry on Escobar out loud. Another said the show felt closer to a slow history documentary than to a gripping drama. One reviewer noted there was more talking laid over the pictures than in an old radio play. Another pointed to a strange pattern, where the show would spend 2 full minutes pouring history over old news footage, then cut to a brief scene whose only job was to have the characters react to facts the audience had just been fed. A magazine review went further still, handing the American half of the show, the half built around the agent and his voice, a low grade, while handing the Colombian half a top one. There is a sharper version of the complaint hiding under the surface one. Several writers pointed out that the narrator does more than slow things down. He stands between the audience and the most interesting person on the show. Escobar is the engine of Narcos, the figure everyone tunes in to watch. And yet his inner life keeps getting crowded out by an outsider explaining him from a distance. The audience hears an American agent's read on Escobar far more than it gets to sit inside Escobar's own head. A thick wall of words goes up around the very heart of the show.
To be fair, some viewers and critics defended the choice, and their case deserves a hearing. They argued that the constant narration is a trick with a purpose. The narrator is an American agent, and his voice is proud, sure of itself, and quick to paint his own side as the heroes. By drowning the show in that one voice, the argument goes, Narcos quietly shows how a powerful country tells the story of a war to make itself look good. The flatness in this reading is the message. It is a clever defense. Even so, a clever reason for a choice does not erase its cost. And the cost shows up plainly in how the show plays from scene to scene. Breaking Bad sits at the far opposite end. Across all 62 of its episodes, there is no narrator standing over the story explaining it. No steady voice fills in the history or tells the audience how to feel. The show builds everything it means out of faces, choices, objects, and the silences between people. When something matters, the show puts it on screen and trusts the audience to catch it. The writing carries the full load, with almost no help from a guiding voice, and it never once seems to buckle under the weight. The simplest test is the one from earlier. How does each show prove that its main figure is dangerous? Narcos would often have its narrator describe Escobar's power and the fear he spread. Breaking Bad does the reverse. In one quiet, tense scene, Walter's wife tells him she is frightened, that one day someone might come knocking at their door with terrible news about him. Walter turns the whole idea around. He tells her she has it backwards, that nobody is coming to hurt him, because he is the danger in this story. He is the one who knocks. No narrator explains how far Walter has fallen. The man shows it himself, in his own words, in a single cold breath. That one line does more than a whole season of narration could. It tells the audience exactly who Walter has become. And it does so through Walter, in a real moment, with his terrified wife sitting right beside him. The fear on her face is part of the meaning. The calm in his voice is part of the meaning. Nothing has to be summed up afterward, because the scene already holds all of it. The show simply puts the man at his coldest in front of the audience and lets the chill do the work. A voice telling everyone that Walter was dangerous would have been thinner and weaker, and people would have felt that difference even without being able to name it. The show's faith in pure scenes runs so deep that it once built an entire episode out of almost nothing. For a full hour, Walter and Jesse are stuck together in their lab, trying to swat a single fly that has gotten inside. That is the whole plot. There is no narrator, no rush of events, no history to deliver. There is only two men in one room, talking, circling each other, and slowly letting their guilt and fear leak out into the open. The episode holds together because the writing trusts the moment completely. A show that needed a voice to prop it up could never dare to attempt a thing like that. Breaking Bad could even hand a man's complete breakdown to the audience without one word of explanation. Late in the fourth season, Walter ends up hiding in the crawl space, the low, dark gap beneath the floor of his own house, having just learned that the money he meant to escape with is gone, and that he is well and truly trapped. He gives no speech. He starts to laugh. The laugh is wrong from the very first sound, too loud and too high, and it cracks apart into something closer to a sob as the camera floats up and away. framing him in the narrow hole in the floor, like a man lying in his own grave. No voice tells the audience that Walter has snapped for a moment. The picture says it all. And it says it better than any sentence ever could. Even the rise of Walter's drug empire, the kind of sweeping change a narrator would normally sum up in a few quick lines, gets shown instead of spoken. The growth of the business plays out in long stretches with no talking at all. Just music and images of work being done, money stacking up, and time slipping by. The audience watches the empire grow rather than being told that it grew. The meaning is baked into what the eye sees. The show treats its pictures as its main way of speaking, and the words as a tool it can mostly do without. The reason Narcos talks so much is not hard to understand, and it circles right back to the cage from the first part. A true story this large, racing across decades and continents and dozens of real people, is genuinely hard to follow. A new viewer with no background could get lost in the first few minutes. The narrator is a rope thrown to that viewer, a steady hand keeping the tangled history straight. Seen that way, the voice is a fair answer to a real and difficult problem. The trouble is that the answer quietly chips away at the drama every single time it opens its mouth. Showing instead of telling asks more of everyone involved. It asks the writers to build meaning into images and silences, which is slow, fussy, painstaking work. It asks the actors to carry whole ideas on their faces with no lines to lean on. And it asks the audience to lean in and pay real attention, since no voice will catch them if they drift. Breaking Bad made that demand and kept making it for 5 seasons straight. And the audience rose up to meet it every time. The show treated the people watching as partners rather than passengers, and they paid it back by watching closely enough to spot a small toy floating in a pool. Something lasting stays with an audience that is trained to watch in that way. People who grew up close reading Breaking Bad learned to trust pictures, to weigh a glance, to expect that even small things carry weight. Narcos asked far less, because its voice was always right there to do the reading for them. There is nothing shameful about an easier watch. Plenty of fine shows hold the viewer's hand the whole way through. The difference is simply that one show built a deep habit of trust between the writer and the audience, and the other set that habit aside for the sake of speed and clarity. This ties straight back to where this whole comparison began. A made-up story can be shown because the writers control every single piece of it and can load meaning into any corner of the frame. A true story, stretched across 20 years, often has to be told because there is simply too much of it to act out in full, and too little of it the writers are free to bend. Showing is the richer path, and the harder one, and Breaking Bad walked it from the first scene to the last. Narcos took the faster road in large part because the harder road was closed to it from the start. None of this turns Narcos into a failure. A great many viewers loved being guided through a history they had never known, and the show taught a real story to a huge crowd that might otherwise never have learned it at all. The narrator did a job, and did it well enough to keep the show clear and always moving. The claim here stays small and exact. On the oldest rule of good storytelling, the rule that the strongest stories show rather than tell, Breaking Bad held the line, and Narcos stepped over it, and the writing on each show carries the clear mark of that single choice. The voice, though, leads to a deeper problem than its own steady chatter, and it is one the show could never quite talk its way out of. That voice belongs to an American agent. The whole series, for 2 full seasons, is shaped around him and his partner, 2 outsiders sent to hunt a man down. And there sits an awkward truth, planted right at the very center of how Narcos was built.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By far the most gripping person on the entire show is the criminal. The men the story actually follows, the agents the audience is meant to ride along beside, are far less interesting than the villain they are chasing. Critics noticed it, fans felt it in their gut, and the show never fully fixed it. The next part digs into that strange imbalance. A show built around its dullest characters, while its best one quietly steals every scene he is in. And what that choice reveals about the simple, huge decision of whose story to tell. Section 4. The show that followed the wrong men. Before a writer works out the plot, before the very first scene is even sketched, one choice quietly shapes everything that comes after. Whose story is this? Through whose eyes will the audience watch the world? That single decision decides who the audience spends its hours beside, whose wins feel like their wins, and whose pain they carry home at the end of the night. Get it right, and a show has a steady, beating heart. Get it wrong, and even a strong story can feel slightly off, like a fine song played in the wrong key. The last part ended on the voice of an American agent guiding Narcos. That agent points straight at the show's deepest crack. Audiences bond with whoever they ride along beside. Time spent inside a person builds a strange kind of loyalty, even when that person does ugly things. The longer a story sits with someone, showing their fears and wants up close, the more the audience starts to feel for them, almost without noticing it happen. This is one of the quiet powers of television. A writer chooses a center, and the crowd's heart slowly bends toward it. So the question of who sits at that center is never a small one. It is close to the whole game. Narcos made its choice early and held it for 2 full seasons. The story follows 2 American agents, Steve Murphy and Javier Peña, sent down to Colombia to help hunt Pablo Escobar. They are the eyes of the show. Murphy carries the narrator's voice. The 2 of them lead the chase, sit in the meetings, take the losses, and stand in for the law against the chaos. The audience is meant to ride with them, to want what they want, to feel the hunt as their own hunt. On paper, that is a perfectly fine plan. 2 lawmen against a monster. A problem shows up almost at once, though, and it never fully goes away. The 2 agents are simply not as interesting as the man they are chasing. Pablo Escobar fills the screen. He is warm and terrifying in the very same breath. A loving father one minute and a mass killer the next. A poor boy who clawed his way to obscene power and then dared an entire country to try and stop him. Beside that, the agents feel thin. They are decent, brave, and a little dull. 2 steady men reacting to a storm they did not create. The villain has a fire the heroes never quite catch. What makes Escobar so hard to look away from is that he holds opposites inside one body. He gave away heaps of money to the poor, built whole neighborhoods of homes for families who had nothing, and won their love so completely that some treated him almost like a saint. He even got himself a seat in the country's government for a time. With those same hands, he ordered bombings, killings, and a long campaign of terror that left a nation bleeding. A man built like that pulls the eye and refuses to let it go. 2 honest agents doing their jobs, however brave, cannot hope to match a figure that strange and that large. The show seems half aware of this, and it works hard to prop the agents up. It hands them the narrator's voice, which keeps them at the center even when Escobar owns all the action. It frames them as the good guys, holding the line. It cuts back to them again and again, asking the audience to care about their stress and their setbacks. Yet all that effort cannot bend the basic math. Every minute spent with the agents is a minute spent away from the one person
nobody can stop watching. The harder the show shoves its lawmen forward, the wider the gap seems to open. This was never a secret felt only by a few sharp viewers. Critics named it plainly and often. One major review called the show a chase in which the American cats were far less interesting than the Colombian mice they hunted. The widely shared summary of the first season noted that the show lacked characters to truly care for and leaned on its speed and its actors to cover up a familiar tale. One writer pointed out that the lead agent, for all his endless talking, stayed a near blank, a man the audience never really got to know.
And the show's one great burst of major praise went to the actor playing Escobar, not to the men chasing him. Underneath all this sits a reason, and it loops right back to the cage from the very first part. Narcos follows the agents because the real story was told from their side. The actual Steve Murphy and Javier Peña were living people who helped catch Escobar, and they worked on the show, sharing their memories and even writing a book about the long hunt. So the show inherited their view of events. It saw the war the way they saw it, from the outside looking in, from the side of the men who wanted Escobar dead, rather than from inside the man himself. That choice carries a hidden trap. A villain is fascinating because he wants things badly and breaks every rule to get them. He drives the story. He makes things happen. A lawman chasing that villain is, by his very nature, mostly reacting. He waits, he follows, he cleans up the mess. He moves second. A show built around the people who move second is always one step behind its own best material. The agents could never be the engine, because in the real story, and in the show alike, Escobar was the engine, and they were only ever the brakes. Breaking Bad never wrestled with this problem for a single moment, because it made the opposite choice without blinking. The person the show follows, and the person the show finds most fascinating, are the very same man. Walter White is the lead and the engine and the mystery all at once. The audience watches through his eyes, wants what he wants, and squirms at what he slowly becomes, all while he sits dead center of every important scene. There is no split between the people the audience rides with and the people who make things happen. They are one and the same person. That single overlap quietly solves 100 problems before they can even start. The audience is bonded to the most active, most dangerous, most surprising person on the show, because that person is also the one they spend every long hour beside. Walter's choices drive the plot forward, and the audience feels each one from the inside out. When he does something terrible, it lands much harder, because by then, the crowd has spent years living behind his eyes and rooting for him against their own better sense. The show never has to prop up a dull center, since its center was never dull for a second. It was the most alive thing on the screen. The clearest way to see the gap is to set the two shows' drug agents next to each other. Narcos hands the badge to Murphy and Peña, and they stay flat across 2 seasons. Breaking Bad has its own drug agent, Walter's brother-in-law, Hank Schrader, and the show treats him as a full and breathing human being. Hank starts out as a loud, joking, chest-thumping guy, the kind who seems built only for comic relief and easy laughs. Then the show does something Narcos rarely dared to try with its own agents. It breaks him wide open and looks honestly inside. After a brush with death in a bombing, and then a brutal parking lot ambush that nearly kills him, Hank changes for good. He suffers crushing panic attacks, the kind that leave him shaking and gasping with no warning at all. For a long stretch, he cannot even walk, and he claws his way back through slow, ugly, painful recovery, snapping at the people who love him out of pure shame. The brave Joker turns into a frightened,
stubborn, wounded man. The show lets the audience sit with every bit of it. And in one perfectly quiet moment, sitting alone in Walter's bathroom, Hank stumbles onto a small clue inside an old book and finally understands that the monster he has hunted for years has been sitting across his own family dinner table the whole time. The look on his face does more than any chase scene ever could.
Hank is everything the Narcos agents are never allowed to be. He is funny and broken and proud and scared. A lawman with a real storm raging inside him. The audience comes to care about him deeply, not because the show announces that he matters, but because the show holds him up at his weakest and lets him earn that care the hard way. Both shows put a drug agent on the screen. One gave that agent a soul to crack open. The other left him as a voice and a job, a steady hand resting on a story that truly belonged to someone else. The richness does not stop with Hank either. Breaking Bad poured that same care into nearly everyone. Jesse Pinkman, Walter's young partner, grows into the broken heart of the whole show. A guilt-soaked kid the audience aches for.
Gus Fring, the calm and chilling villain who runs the drug trade from behind the counter of a fast food chain, is slowly revealed to be a man driven by an old wound, the loss of someone close to him years before at the hands of a rival, and a patient, ice-cold hunger to make that rival finally pay. That buried history makes him as deep and as human as any hero on the show. Even the small side players feel like real people with full lives of their own, a whole world of faces the audience is glad to follow. All of this comes down to a simple lesson about where to point the camera. A story is only ever as strong as the people it asks the audience to live beside. Breaking Bad pointed its lens at its most fascinating soul and never once looked away. Narcos pointed its lens at the watchers instead of the watched, at the men holding the net rather than the wild thing trapped inside it. Both shows had a truly great character. Only one of them built itself around that character. The other kept its finest creation at arm's length, framed forever through the eyes of plainer, lesser men. None of this means Narcos was empty apart from Escobar. The Colombian side of the show is full of vivid figures, ruthless bosses, and clever fixers, and frightened families. People drawn with real and careful skill. Later, when the show moved on to a different cartel, it found fresh characters who carried their own stories well. The flaw was never that Narcos could not write interesting people. The flaw was that it kept choosing to stand beside its least interesting ones, the outsiders, while the most alive people on the whole show were the ones being hunted. And that choice, like so much else about the show, was partly forced rather than freely made. A true story, told from the records of two real agents, almost has to ride along with those agents. The cage shaped the camera. Breaking Bad, free to invent its entire world, could place its center exactly where the drama burned hottest, deep inside the mind of the man breaking every rule. Narcos, tied to what truly happened and to whose memories happened to survive, was dragged toward the side of the law whether the real drama lived there or not. This is the choice that sits underneath all the others. Before planting and payoff, before showing over telling, a writer has to pick a heart for the story and then trust the audience to follow it there. Breaking Bad picked the most gripping person it had and set the whole show on his shoulders. Narcos picked the men with the badges, partly by choice and partly by history. And so it spent 2 seasons sitting slightly off-center, its strongest character forever just out of reach, behind a wall of narration and a pair of steady, ordinary heroes. There is one more cruel twist waiting inside this problem, and it makes everything worse. The single magnetic character at the heart of Narcos, The one person the whole show truly came alive around was a real man with a real death already written into the history books. The show did not merely keep him at arm's length behind its narrators. It was also forced to lose him completely, at a moment it did not choose, far earlier than any made-up show would ever surrender its finest creation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Pablo Escobar had to die at the close of the second season, because the real Pablo Escobar died exactly when he did, and no writer alive could change that date. The show's best reason to keep watching was ripped away on a schedule set decades before a single frame was ever shot. The next part looks at what happens to a story when it is forced to kill its greatest character right on time, and how that one unavoidable loss left behind a hole that Narcos spent the rest of its life trying and never quite managing to fill. Section 5. A death on someone else's clock. The ending of a story is the moment everything else has been building toward. It is where a tale finally means what it means, where all the small pieces snap together and land their full weight at once. Fumble an ending, and a great story can curdle in memory. Nail one, and even a flawed story can feel whole and complete. Because of that, the power to choose an ending is one of the most precious things a writer can ever hold. The last part showed that the one truly great character on Narcos was its villain. This part shows the cruelest catch hidden inside that simple fact. The show was never once allowed to keep him. Every made-up story owns its own ending. The writers decide when the hero wins or loses, when the villain falls, when the lights go out for good. They can hold a character back for years and then spend him at the exact right second. They can time a death so it breaks the heart as hard as a death possibly can. A true story has no such gift at all. The ending already happened, out in the real world, on a real day, and it cannot be nudged by even a single hour. The writer can only walk toward it and meet it whenever it finally comes. Narcos ran straight into this wall with its greatest character. Pablo Escobar was a real man, and the real Pablo Escobar was shot and killed on a rooftop in Medellin in December of 1993, run down at last by the forces that had hunted him for years. That date was carved in stone long before the show ever existed. So the writers of Narcos sat down already knowing that the most magnetic person they had, the only figure the whole show truly came alive around, had a death waiting for him at a set time that no script could ever push back. They could circle him, study him, and bring him to life. They could not save him, and they could not stretch him out. The show reaches that ending at the close of its second season. Escobar, cornered and nearly alone, runs across the rooftops as the men hunting him close in from every side. The shots come. He falls onto the tiles and dies there in the open air, his huge story snuffed out in a handful of seconds. The screen suddenly empty of the only person who had ever truly held it. The scene is well made and faithful to the real day, but the instant it ends, a hard truth lands right alongside it. The show has just killed off the one thing keeping millions of people glued to their screens. And it did so because a history book, not a writer, decided the time had come. Some praised the show for the boldness of reaching Escobar's death in only 2 seasons, rather than dragging it out forever. There is something to that. A weaker show might have stalled and stretched the hunt across 4 or 5 years just to keep its star around a little longer. Still, the deeper truth is plainer. The show did not really have a free choice here. Escobar died when he died. To stay honest to the real story, Narcos had to follow that timeline, and following it meant burying its best character only 2 seasons in. far sooner than any made-up show would ever surrender a creation that good. What came next was the real test, and it exposed the full size of the hole. With Escobar gone, Narcos had to ask a frightening question for any show. What now? The man who carried 2 seasons was dead.
The actor who earned the show its loudest praise had left.
The chase that gave the story its whole shape was finished. A made-up show never has to face this on someone else's schedule, because it would simply keep its best character alive and working until the writers themselves chose otherwise. Narcos had no such option in its hands. It had to start over almost completely from scratch. So the 3rd season hit the reset button hard. The show turned away from Escobar and toward a fresh set of villains, the bosses of a different drug group based in the city of Cali, run chiefly by a pair of brothers who treated their cocaine empire less like a war and more like a calm and ruthless business. One of the agents from before, Javier Peña, was pushed to the center and handed the narrator's voice. The other lead agent, the one who had guided the first 2 seasons, left the show entirely. A batch of new faces filled nearly every important role. A viewer tuning in could be forgiven for thinking they had stumbled onto a different program that just happened to share a name. Critics felt the size of the shift and said so out loud. One major review flatly called the new season nearly a new show, with only scraps of what came before still hanging on. Others noted that the 3rd season took a handful of episodes just to find its feet, opening slowly as it set up its fresh world and its fresh players. The show was rebuilding itself in plain view, laying a whole new foundation because the old one had been carried off on a date set decades earlier. Whatever real strengths the new season went on to find, it had to find them only after losing the entire beating heart of itself. To be fair, the reset largely worked. Plenty of viewers and critics felt the 3rd season held up well, and a few even argued it stood as strong as what came before, praising its tighter focus and its sharp new villains.
The show proved it could survive the loss of its star, which is no small feat. Survival was never really in question. The claim here is narrower and sharper than that. A show should never have to prove that it can survive losing its best character only 2 seasons in. The single reason Narcos was ever forced to take that risk is that history, and not the writers, held the controls over its ending. Breaking Bad lived in the opposite world once again. It owned its ending completely, down to the very last second. The writers decided how long Walter White would last, how far he would fall, and exactly when and how his story would finally close. They were never racing toward a date carved in stone by real life. They held the clock in their own 2 hands. And they used that power to do something a true story can almost never manage. They designed a death. From very early on, the show was building toward Walter's downfall on purpose, laying the pieces down season by season so that when the collapse finally came, it would feel both shocking and fully deserved. The writers knew where the man was headed, because they had decided where he was headed all the way back at the start. Nothing about his fall was an accident of the calendar. Every step downward was placed, weighed, and timed with care. The world outside never handed the show its ending. The writers grew that ending inside the show themselves, on purpose, over 5 careful years. The choice to end at all was the show's own, too. Rather than stretch the story for as long as people would keep watching, the people behind Breaking Bad chose to bring it to a close while it was still strong, telling the full tale they meant to tell, and then stopping cleanly. That kind of chosen, deliberate ending is a luxury a true story almost never allows. Narcos was forced to keep going past its natural peak, hunting for new life after its heart had already stopped beating. Breaking Bad walked up to its own finish line and crossed it on purpose, at the exact moment it wanted to. Walter's final episode shows just how much control that freedom gave. Walter, dying of his cancer and out of time, returns home for one last round. He quietly arranges money for his family, frees his old partner from the gang of killers holding him captive, settles his scores in one final burst of violence, and then dies among the lab equipment he had come to love, as the police close in around him. Before the end, he finally tells his wife the truth he had buried for 5 seasons, admitting at last that he had done all of it for himself, because the work made him feel alive and powerful, and that his talk of doing it for the family had been a lie he told so he could live with himself. The writers placed that confession and that death exactly where they would mean the most. That ending lands so hard because the writers chose every single part of it. They picked the place, the lab, so Walter could die beside the only thing that ever truly made him happy. They picked the timing, after his empire and his family were already lost, so his death felt like the last grim payment on a long and ugly debt. They picked his final words so the whole show clicked into focus in one honest breath. No real date or real grave forced any of it. The writers built all of it by hand, to send the audience out the door feeling the full weight of everything they had just watched. Sticking the landing is one of the hardest things in all of television, and most shows fumble it badly. A story can run beautifully for years and then trip at the very finish, leaving its fans angry and a little betrayed. Breaking Bad did the reverse, and its last episode is held up again and again as a model of how to end a show right, tying off every loose thread and sending its hero out with brutal honesty. The reason it could do that is the reason behind everything else in this comparison. The writers owned the ending and had years to get it exactly right. A show chained to a true death has no such room to shape and perfect its final hour. Held up side by side, the two endings reveal a gap impossible to miss. Narcos lost its greatest character on a schedule set by a bullet fired in real life, decades before. Breaking Bad gave its greatest character a death composed like a piece of music, timed and shaped for the deepest possible effect. One show was forced to say goodbye far too soon, and then scramble to rebuild from the ground up. The other said goodbye exactly when it meant to, having spent years getting every note ready to play. A bullet ended Escobar's story. A writer ended Walter's. This matters far more than it might first appear, because the ending is where a story's meaning finally settles for good. Walter's death tells the audience what the whole show was secretly about the entire time, that a man can dress up his hunger as love for his family for years, and only confess the truth when it is far, far too late to matter. The writers could only deliver that meaning because they controlled the final beat. Escobar's death, strong as the scene is, mostly tells the audience what the history books had already said, that the long hunt ended on a certain rooftop on a certain day. One ending was authored, the other was reported. And this circles right back to the cage that has shaped this entire comparison. Breaking Bad held a blank page and could write any ending it wished, then spend years building steadily toward it. Narcos held a true story and could only trace the ending that already existed, then live with whatever that loss did to the show afterward. The freedom to choose a death is the freedom to give that death its full meaning. The duty to honor a real death is the duty to accept whatever meaning was already sitting there, ready-made, in the cold public record. This is the deepest layer of the same single difference that has run through every part so far. A made-up world lets a writer own the most important moment of all, the ending, and aim it like an arrow at the heart. A true story strips that moment away and hands the writer a fixed point on a calendar instead. Breaking Bad owned its ending and used it to crown 5 seasons of patient, careful work. Narcos lost its ending and its best character along with it, to a date that no one on the show could ever touch, and then spent its remaining life rebuilding around the empty space he left behind. All of this freedom, all of this control over beginnings and middles and endings alike, points toward one single hour. Somewhere in its final stretch, Breaking Bad gathered up every tool it had ever used, every buried clue, every quiet choice, every careful step of Walter's long fall, and poured them all into one episode. That episode is widely called the finest single hour in the entire history of television. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. It holds a perfect, or very nearly perfect, score from millions of ordinary viewers, and it has topped lists of the greatest television episodes ever made. It is the moment when all the planting finally pays off, and the whole tall tower comes crashing down at once. Narcos, for all its real strengths, has no single hour that even tries to reach that height. The next part steps inside that one episode, the towering peak that 5 seasons of total control made possible, and shows exactly what kind of writing a show can do when it has owned its story whole from the very first frame. Section this: the hour everything comes crashing down. 5 seasons of careful work all point toward one single hour of television. Everything built in the parts before this, the freedom to invent, the buried clues, the trust in pictures over words, the man placed dead center, the death the writers got to design. All of it folds into one episode near the very end of Breaking Bad. That episode is widely called the greatest single-hour television has ever produced. Its name is Ozymandias, and it stands as the clearest proof of everything this comparison has been arguing, because it is an hour Narcos, by its very nature, could never have made. A great series can be made of many fine episodes that never quite reach a single peak. A truly great episode is something far rarer. It gathers up everything a show has spent years building and cashes it all in at once, in 60 unbroken minutes, with no wasted breath. Every old choice comes due. Every quiet setup pays off. The whole story bends toward this 1 hour, and then breaks clean across it. To pull that off, a show must have years of its own past to draw from, and full control over every single piece of it. Breaking Bad had both. The name of the episode is a clue to what it does. Ozymandias is the title of an old poem about a long-dead king who once ruled a mighty empire. In the poem, a traveler finds the king's giant statue lying broken and half-buried in an empty desert. The great kingdom around it crumbled into dust and sand. Nothing left but ruins and a boastful name carved in stone. The poem is about how everything a powerful man builds will one day fall and be forgotten. The show borrowed that name for the hour where Walter White's empire, the one he killed and lied for years to build, finally crumbles into nothing at all. Ozymandias opens by looking all the way back to the beginning. A scene from the very first days plays out. Walter and his young partner Jesse, standing in the empty desert beside their old motorhome, cooking their first batch. Back when Walter was still a nervous teacher, practicing the lies he would tell his wife on the phone. The desert is quiet and almost innocent. Then that early scene slowly fades away, and the same patch of desert returns in the present day, no longer quiet. Now the site of a gun battle that has just ended in blood.
In a few short seconds, the show draws a straight line from the small first sin to the enormous disaster it grew into. What follows is one blow after another, with no time to breathe in between them. Walter's brother-in-law, Hank, the drug agent who finally caught him, lies captured by a gang of killers in that same desert. Walter begs for Hank's life and offers the gang his entire fortune, some $80 million, to let him walk away. Hank refuses to beg for anything. He tells Walter, calm and clear-eyed, that the leader of the gang made up his mind long ago, and that even the smartest man Walter believes himself to be cannot talk his way out of this one. Then the gang shoots Hank dead, right there in front of Walter's eyes. From there, everything Walter built keeps falling away in great chunks. The gang takes nearly all of his money, leaving him a single barrel out of many. In a fit of grief and blind rage, Walter turns on Jesse, the partner he once worked to protect, and hands him straight over to the same killers. And before they drag Jesse off into the dark, Walter chooses to wound him one final time, telling him the cruelest secret he has been carrying for years. The empire, the money, the family ties, the very last shred of loyalty, all of it comes apart inside this one single hour. That cruel secret is where the hour shows its true power, because it reaches all the way back to the start of the show. Walter tells Jesse, flatly and without mercy, that he was there the night Jesse's girlfriend Jane died, that he stood by and watched her choke and chose to let it happen. The choice covered in the very first part of this comparison, made whole seasons earlier, comes roaring back at the worst possible moment to land its final, devastating blow. The clue was planted years before. The payoff arrives right here in the rubble, and it hits like a hammer, because the audience has quietly carried that secret the entire time. Its hardest scene comes at the home. Walter returns to his house to gather his family and run, but they already know the truth. They know Hank is gone, and they know exactly what Walter really is. His wife grabs a kitchen knife. A struggle breaks out on the living room floor, husband against wife, while their teenage son throws himself in front of his mother to shield her and calls the police in a blind panic. The family Walter swore he had done all of this to protect now fights him off with everything they have. Cornered and breaking apart, Walter snatches up his baby daughter and flees the house. A phone call closes out the hour, and it is one of the most complicated moments the show ever wrote. Knowing the police are listening in, Walter calls his wife and screams a stream of cruel, hateful words at her, painting her as a helpless innocent and himself as the only monster. The words are vicious enough to make the skin crawl. Yet, under them, runs a hidden purpose. By taking all of the blame out loud, Walter is trying to clear his wife in the eyes of the law, to save her even as he loses her forever. He is crying as he does it. Two opposite things, raw hatred and a last twisted act of love, live inside the same call at the very same time. Across its full length, the hour gives the audience no place to rest. Most episodes offer a small breather somewhere, a lighter beat, a moment to recover before the next sharp turn. Ozymandias flatly refuses. It is a steady fall, one loss stacked on top of the next. From the death in the desert, to the broken home, to the cruel phone call, never once letting up its grip. The writing trusts that the audience can bear the whole weight, and that the unbroken pressure will land far harder than any pause ever could. By the final minute, everything Walter spent 5 long seasons building is simply gone. Every bit of this hour works because it is the harvest of 5 whole seasons of writing brought to a head at once. The first cook in the desert pays off. The watching of Jane's death pays off. The slow poisoning of every family bond pays off. The lie that he did it all for his family, repeated season after season, pays off the instant his family turns a knife on him.
Nothing in this hour would mean a single thing without the long, patient, fully controlled build-up standing behind it. The episode is the moment when the whole carefully wired machine finally goes off. The world recognized at once what it had just seen. For more than 10 years, this single hour stood as the only episode of television ever to earn a flawless score from the great mass of ordinary viewers who rate such things. A feat no other episode of any show had ever managed to reach. It topped a major magazine's list of the greatest television episodes ever made. The writer who penned it won the industry's top writing prize for that very script. Years later, fans of a rival show flooded its rating with low marks on purpose, nudging it a hair below perfect. But its place in history had been secure for a long, long time. This single hour became a kind of shorthand. When people argue over the best television ever made, this episode is one of the first names spoken, a measuring stick that others get held up against. It is studied, written about, and replayed as a clear example of how high television can climb. A single hour of one show turned into a marker for all of television. Very few episodes of anything have ever carried that kind of weight, and almost none have held on to it for as long. None of this happened by accident. The Hour was written by Moira Wally Beckett, who shaped every fall and every cruel turn with care, and directed by Ryan Johnson, who would later go on to make big films of his own. The two of them treated the episode like people who knew exactly what they were building and how much rode on it. There is no narrator anywhere in it, no calm voice explaining the pain, no easy shortcut taken to soften the blow. The whole hour trusts its images and its actors to carry a weight that would flatten a lesser show. That trust was earned across 5 seasons, and it pays off in full right here. Narcos has nothing that comes close to this. This is simply a plain fact about the two shows, with no insult intended. Narcos has strong episodes, tense episodes, even genuinely thrilling ones. And the death of Escobar at the end of its 2nd season is a powerful piece of television. But the show has no single hour that lands among the greatest ever made. No episode held up as a high mark for all of television. Its best-rated hours sit well below the peak Breaking Bad reached, and the show was never once honored in the top writing prizes the way that one Breaking Bad hour was. There is a clear reason for that, and it runs through everything said so far. An hour like Ozymandias can only be built by a show that owns its whole past and controls every piece of its future. The episode works because the writers had been planting seeds for 5 straight seasons and could choose the exact moment to spring them all at once. Narcos could never gather such an hour because it did not own its story in the same way. Its biggest moments were real events being acted out, lifted straight from history and staged with care. A reenactment, however well made, cannot pay off 5 seasons of secret planning, because there was no secret planning there to pay off. The gap between the two shows is widest at the very top. A middling hour of Narcos and a middling hour of Breaking Bad might not feel so far apart. Both can be tense and well shot and gripping in the moment. But when each show reaches for its highest gear, the difference opens into a canyon. Breaking Bad in its highest gear produced an hour many call the best ever made. Narcos in its highest gear produced a faithful, well-staged version of a famous true death. One peak was authored out of nothing. The other was copied straight from the record. Something about an hour like that stays lodged in the people who watched it the first time.
They remember where they were sitting, how the room felt, the long, heavy silence after it ended. The hour did more than tell a story well. It put the audience through something. A slow collapse felt almost in the body, made bearable only by how perfectly it had all been built. That kind of memory is among the rarest things a show can leave behind, and it grows straight out of the years of control that made the hour possible in the first place. This single episode is the whole argument pressed down into 1 hour. The freedom to invent let the writers build a man worth destroying. The patient planting let them load the hour with payoffs years in the making. The trust in showing over telling let the collapse play out in faces and silences instead of a narrator's tidy summary. The choice to keep the camera on the most gripping person let every blow land from the inside. And the control over the ending let them set this peak exactly where it would do the most damage. Every strength described in this whole comparison meets in Ozymandias at the very same time. Narcos, meanwhile, kept reaching for a different kind of strength entirely, one it believed set it apart from a made-up show like Breaking Bad. The whole pitch of Narcos was that it was telling a true story, that the wild things on the screen had really happened. For a long time, that truth felt like the show's secret weapon, the one thing that made it grip harder than any pure invention ever could. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But that very claim, the proud promise that all of this was real, turned out to be a trap with sharp teeth. The moment a show swears its story is true, every change it makes for the sake of drama becomes a lie that someone out there can catch it telling. And the real people tangled up in the Escobar story, including the men who hunted him and the family he left behind, were watching closely, counting the show's mistakes one by one. The next part steps right into that trap and shows how being a true story ended up costing Narcos far more than it ever paid back. Section 7. The price of saying it is all true. Telling a true story sounds like a pure gift. Real events carry a weight that made-up ones have to work hard to earn. When a show promises that the wild things on screen actually happened, the audience leans in closer, because reality holds a strange kind of power. Narcos built much of its appeal on exactly that promise. The last part ended on this very pitch, the idea that the truth was the show's secret weapon. This part shows the hidden bill that came along with it, a bill that Breaking Bad, free from any link to real life, never once had to pay. From its opening moments, Narcos sells itself as the real thing. A card on the screen tells the audience that the story is drawn from true events, that these were living people and real crimes. That promise does real work. The bombings, the bribes, the bodies, all of it lands harder once a viewer believes it truly took place. A made-up villain can be frightening, but a villain who actually walked the earth and did these things is frightening in a deeper, colder way. The truth was meant to be the thing that set Narcos apart and gave it an edge no invented show could ever match. A sharp catch hides inside that promise, though, and it has teeth. The instant a show swears its story is true, it hands the whole world a way to check its work. Every viewer who knows the real history becomes a kind of judge. Every person who actually lived the events becomes a witness who can stand up and say, that is not how it happened. A made-up story can never be caught lying because it makes no claim to truth in the first place. A true story invites the very correction it can never fully avoid. And the people closest to the Escobar story did not stay quiet. The loudest correction came from inside the story itself. Pablo Escobar had a son, a man now known as Sebastián Marroquín, who lived through those violent years as a boy and later grew up to become a writer living far from Colombia. After the second season aired, he sat down and listed, out in the open, 28 separate things the show had gotten wrong about his family and his father. He went point by point, calm and steady, tearing small holes in the show's version of events.
The very first thing on his list was that the show had turned one of his relatives, a man who was never a criminal at all, into a drug trafficker, simply because the story played better that way. That kind of correction stings in a way no review ever could. A critic can dislike a show. A son who lived the real story can prove the show is false. When the person who was actually there counts up 28 separate mistakes, the proud claim of truth starts to look awfully thin. The show had reached for the power of reality, and reality reached right back to point out where it had cheated. Each change the writers made to sharpen the drama became a small lie that someone with first-hand knowledge could hold up to the light. The corrections did not stop with the family. The two real drug agents the show was built around, the men who actually hunted Escobar, also stepped forward to draw the line between fact and fiction. They were shown as hard-drinking, rule-breaking cowboys, the kind who kept bottles of liquor sitting right on their desks. One of them said plainly that this was Hollywood paint. They had bent rules and broken procedures, sure, but they never kept booze on their desks and never once broke the actual law. The men otherwise enjoyed the show and praised it. They simply could not let the wilder touches stand, because the made-up version had reshaped real people into something flashier than they ever were. One change cut closer to home for those men. In the show, the wife of one agent is sent fleeing to another country to escape the danger, packed off far away while her husband stays behind in the fight. In real life, she never fled at all. She stayed put in the same city through the whole frightening stretch. The real woman was unhappy to see her own life rewritten on screen, her steadiness traded for a more dramatic escape that simply never happened. A small change, made to crank up the tension, quietly erased the truth of a real person's choices. The list of changes runs long. The show left out one of Escobar's own brothers, a real and important figure named Roberto, simply written out of the story as if he had never existed. It placed one of its agents in Colombia earlier than he truly arrived. It built whole characters out of thin air and dropped them into the real history as if they had always belonged there. It moved events around, shifted who did what, and bent the timeline to fit a cleaner, tidier shape. Each single change might seem small on its own. Stacked together, they show a true story being quietly reshaped, over and over, into something more like a story and a little less like the truth. And here lies the trap that being a true story always sets. The writers of Narcos faced an ugly choice on nearly every page. They could stay perfectly faithful to the messy real events and accept that messy real events rarely fall into a clean, gripping shape on their own. Or they could reshape the truth into stronger drama and accept that every reshaping was a crack the world could find and pry wide open. Faithful meant flatter. Dramatic meant false. No path gave them both at the same time. Because the source of their story was a fixed reality they did not control and could not move. This is the same cage from the very first part, seen now from a fresh angle. Being chained to real events does not only limit the shape of a story, the way it forced Escobar's death to land on a set date. It also drags the story into a fight it can never win. The fight between making good drama and telling the honest truth. Pushing toward drama costs the claim to truth. pushing toward truth costs the grip on drama. The cage squeezes from both sides at once, and there is no comfortable place to stand anywhere inside it.
Breaking Bad lived completely free of this whole problem.
There is no real Walter White. There was never a true meth empire out in the New Mexico desert that the show had to honor or get right. No son of a real kingpin could ever stand up and list the things the show got wrong, because there was nothing real for it to get wrong in the first place. The show owed nothing to any record, any history, any living witness. Its only duty in the world was to itself, to its own invented world, and to the rules it had set for that world. That freedom is bigger than it first appears. Because Breaking Bad answered to no real facts, it could shape every single event purely for meaning and for drama. If a moment served the story better one way, the writers simply wrote it that way, with no real history standing in the road. They never once had to choose between a gripping scene and an honest one, because in their made-up world, the gripping scene was the honest one. The only truth they had to serve was the truth of their own characters, and that truth was entirely theirs to build from scratch. A made-up show cannot be accused of getting the facts wrong, because it sets every fact itself. When Walter does something shocking, no expert can write an article proving the real Walter would never have done such a thing. When the show changes a detail, no witness can come forward to correct it. The story is sealed inside its own world, judged only by whether it holds together and rings true to the people it invented. That sealed freedom let the writers chase the strongest version of every scene without ever once looking over their shoulder. The one kind of falseness a made-up show can fall into is a betrayal of itself. If a character suddenly acts in a way that makes no sense for who they are, or the world breaks its own rules for the sake of a cheap twist, the audience feels the lie, even without any outside fact to check against. This is the only truth a made-up story owes: the truth of staying honest to its own people and its own logic. Breaking Bad guarded that truth fiercely. Walter always behaved like Walter, even at his very worst, his choices flowing straight out of the man the show had carefully built. The story never cheated its own world, and so it never once felt false, even while every single word of it was invented. At the bottom of all this sits a point about what a writer's real job truly is. A storyteller shapes events to carry meaning, cutting away the dull parts, sharpening the sharp ones, arranging everything so it lands with force. A true story fights that job at every turn, because real life is shapeless, and the writer is not allowed to reshape it freely without telling a lie. A made-up story welcomes that job, because shaping is the whole of what it is. Breaking Bad got to do the pure work of storytelling. Narcos had to do that same work, with one hand tied to what really happened. None of this means a true story is a bad idea. The pull of real events is genuine and strong, and Narcos used it well. Many viewers stayed glued to the screen precisely because they knew the madness in front of them had truly happened, that no writer had simply dreamed it up. There is a reason people say of certain real tales that no one could make this up. The truth gave Narcos a grip on the audience that pure invention has to fight hard to earn. The point here is only that this grip came at a real and steady cost. It is also fair to say that some changes are normal and harmless. Every true story turned into a drama trims and shifts a little, and no one expects a flawless record. And the people pointing out the errors carry their own slant. A son defending his father's memory is not a neutral judge, and the real agents naturally wanted their own version of events to stand. Still, even granting all of that, the basic problem holds firm. A show that builds its name on truth has handed the world a scorecard, and the world will always use it.
This ties straight back to the freedom that has run through every part of this comparison. The freedom to invent a world brings more than control over the plot and the ending. It also brings freedom from any debt to reality. The freedom to never be wrong about the facts, because there are no outside facts to answer to at all. Breaking Bad held that double freedom and used it to build a story shaped entirely for meaning. Narcos surrendered it the moment it promised the truth, and spent its whole run quietly paying the bill that promise sent. There is a quiet irony buried in all of this. The very thing Narcos offered as its single greatest strength, its grounding in real events, turned out to be one of its heaviest weights. The truth that drew people in was the same truth that boxed the writers in and exposed their every change to the light.
A made-up show like Breaking Bad gave up the easy power of saying, "This really happened." And in exchange, it gained total freedom to make its story whatever it needed to be. Over the long run, that trade clearly favored the show that owed nothing to the past. All of this, every part of it so far, could still be brushed aside as the opinion of fans who simply love one show more than the other. The control, the planting, the showing over telling, the chosen ending, the towering peak hour, the cost of truth. A doubter could wave the whole thing away as nothing more than taste. So the fair move now is to turn, at last, to the people whose actual job is to judge writing, and to the wider crowd of critics who watch hundreds of shows for a living. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The writers of the industry, voting on their own craft, and the critics who rate shows by the dozen, both handed down a verdict on these two programs. One walked away buried in the highest honors a show can win, praised again and again as one of the greatest ever made. The other earned solid notices and a small handful of nods for things like its music and its opening titles, while going almost entirely unrecognized in the prizes that reward writing itself. The next part lays that whole scoreboard out in full and shows just how lopsided the official record between these two shows really is. Section 8. The verdict of the people who judge writing. Everything argued so far could be called the love of a fan dressed up as analysis. A doubter could shrug and say it all comes down to taste in the end. So the fair thing now is to set opinion aside and look at the scoreboard kept by people whose actual job is to judge television, and most of all by the people whose job is to judge writing. Their verdict on these two shows is not close. It is one of the most lopsided records two shows in the same field have ever left behind. And it lines up, point for point, with everything the earlier parts laid out. The single most important judge here is an easy one to name. There is a guild made up of working television writers, the very people who sit in rooms and build stories for a living. And once a year, they vote on the best written shows of the year. No jury on earth is better suited to settle a fight about writing, because the voters are writers themselves, judging the one thing they understand better than anyone alive. Their opinion on Breaking Bad and Narcos is about as far apart as an opinion can possibly get. Breaking Bad was nominated for that writer's prize 20 separate times across its run, and it carried 6 of them home. 6 different times, a room full of professional writers looked over the entire year of television and decided that Breaking Bad held the finest writing in the whole field. Narcos, across its complete original run of 3 seasons, was nominated for that very same prize exactly once, for a single episode. And it did not win even that one. 6 wins set against 0. 20 nominations set against a single one.
The people who write television for a living looked at these two shows and barely saw a contest at all. The biggest awards in all of television, the Emmys, tell the very same story even louder. Breaking Bad was nominated 58 times and won 16 of those, including the top prize for the best drama on television, which it took home twice. Its lead actor won 4 times. 2 of its supporting actors won as well. And, fitting for this whole comparison, it won the Emmy for the best writing in a drama, handed to the writer of that towering peak episode covered earlier.
From its lead actor, to its supporting cast, to its scripts, to the show as a whole, Breaking Bad was showered in the highest honors the medium has to give, year after year. Narcos stands in sharp contrast, and the shape of its contrast is the most telling part of all. The show was not shut out completely. In its first year, it earned 3 Emmy nominations. Yet the nature of those 3 nominations is the telling part. 1 was for the design of its opening titles. 1 was for the music of its opening theme. 1 was for the editing, the work of cutting the footage together. Every single one of those nominations was for the craft surrounding the writing, the polish on the outside. The writing itself drew none. That pattern is the very heart of this entire section. Narcos was good enough to be noticed for its music, its titles, and its editing. The people who judged television clearly saw real skill in how the show was put together. Yet when it came to the writing, the very thing this comparison is about, the show went almost completely unseen. A program can be praised for 100 things and still leave its writing in the shadows. And that is exactly what happened here. The judges admired the frame and the polish and walked right past the story. One more piece fits this puzzle neatly. The actor who played Escobar did earn real notice, picking up a nomination at another major television award for his performance. That fits everything said before. The performance was loved. The character was magnetic. The thing the world responded to in Narcos was the man on screen and the actor bringing him to life. The very things rooted in a true story and a great cast. The writing, the actual building of the story itself, kept getting left off every list. The wider crowd of critics, the people who watch and rate dozens of shows every year, came down the same way. There are big websites that gather every critic's verdict into a single score. On those scores, Breaking Bad climbed higher and higher with each passing season, ending with a final year rated near the very top of the scale, a number almost no show ever reaches. Several of its seasons earned a flawless mark from the critics counted there. And in one of the most striking honors of all, it was officially entered into the record books in 2014 as the most praised television show of all time. Narcos, on those very same scales, landed as a solid, well-liked show, and no more than that. Its scores were good, the kind that mark a show worth watching, but they sat comfortably below the all-time greats. The short summary the critics agreed on for its first season is itself revealing. It praised the show's acting and its pace, while admitting that the show leaned on that very speed to cover up a story that felt familiar and already told. Strong, watchable, and a little well-worn. That was the verdict, written down in plain terms for anyone to read. Awards are far from perfect, and any honest look has to admit it. Great shows get snubbed all the time, and weaker shows sometimes win on timing or buzz alone. The year a show airs, the crowd it competes against, the platform it lives on, all of these can swing a result that has little to do with quality. Narcos also arrived in one of the most crowded stretches of great television ever, fighting for attention against a flood of strong shows. A single snub proves almost nothing on its own. Any fair view has to grant every bit of that.
The trouble for Narcos is that this was never a single snub. It is the same result, over and over, coming from every direction at once. The Writers Guild said one thing. The Emmys said the same thing. The critics' scores said it yet again.
And inside each of those separate verdicts sat the very same precise detail. The recognition flowing toward the show's music, its titles, its editing, and its lead actor, while flowing away from its writing. When every judge in the building reaches the same conclusion and reaches it on the exact point in question, the result stops looking like bad luck. To round out the picture fairly, the show's later companion series, the one that moved the story to a different country, actually drew somewhat warmer reviews than the original. The makers clearly learned and sharpened their craft over time. The franchise was never weak or careless about its work. But even at its best, it stayed firmly inside the band of good, strong, enjoyable television, the kind people happily recommend to a friend, rather than climbing into the rare air of the all-time greats. The ceiling held, season after season, show after show. All of this matches the craft case built across the earlier parts with almost eerie neatness. The argument was that Breaking Bad's writing reached a height Narcos could not because of the freedom one show held and the cage the other lived inside. And here, from every official judge of television, comes a verdict that says precisely that. The professionals who study writing for a living, the biggest awards in the whole medium, and the massed ranks of critics all agree. One show wrote at the very top of the form. The other wrote well, within limits it could never escape. One thing should be clear about what these awards do and do not prove. They do not explain why Breaking Bad is better written. The real reasons appeared in every part before this: the control, the planting, the showing, the chosen ending, the freedom from a true story's heavy debt. The awards are simply the outside world catching up to those reasons and writing them down on a public record. A scoreboard never makes a team good. It only reports how good the team already was. Here, the scoreboard reports a blowout. The most powerful number in this whole section is still the writer's verdict, and it deserves a moment of real thought. When a person who has never written a show praises its writing, that is a kind but soft opinion. When a room full of people who build stories for a living, who know in their bones exactly how hard each choice is, looks over a year of television and picks Breaking Bad 6 separate times, that praise carries the full weight of true expertise. The hardest crowd in the world to impress, the writers themselves, were the ones most certain of the answer. A scoreboard, though, only ever tells the what, never the why. It records that one show wrote better, season after season, but it cannot explain how that gap opened up in the first place. Numbers do not write themselves. Behind every one of those wins sat real people in real rooms making real choices. And the way those rooms were built turns out to be its own quiet part of the story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One show was steered by a single clear mind with a single clear plan, backed by a small, steady team of writers free to invent whatever the story happened to need. The other was assembled to serve a sprawling, true history, shaped as much by what had really happened as by anyone's private vision. The next part steps behind the camera, into the rooms where the writing actually got made, and shows how the way a show is built behind the scenes ends up written all over whatever lands on the screen. Section 9. One steering hand against a crowd serving history. The scoreboard from the last part cannot write itself. Behind every award and every score sits a question the numbers leave unanswered. How did one show pull so far ahead of the other? The honest answer lives behind the camera, in the way each show was run, in who held the wheel and what they were steering toward.
The shape of the writing on the screen grows straight out of the shape of the work that made it. And these two shows were built in ways almost as different as the stories they ended up telling. A television show is the work of many hands, but it still needs a center, a guiding idea that keeps every choice pulling in one direction. Without that center, a show can drift, with one episode tugging this way and the next tugging that way, until the whole thing slowly loses its shape. With a strong center, every part lines up, and a story years long can feel like a single unbroken thought. The question of who or what sits at that center, quietly holding everything together, decides a great deal about how a show finally turns out. Breaking Bad had one clear mind at its center, from the very first day to the last.
A single man named Vince Gilligan came up with the idea, ran the show across all 5 seasons, and carried the entire plan in his head the whole time. He was the one who decided, back at the very start, that the show would turn a mild teacher into a monster. And he held that plan steady through every twist and every season. 62 hours of television, one guiding hand on the wheel. Whatever changed along the way, the deepest idea of the show never once wandered, because one person was always there to keep it on course. That man had spent years before this learning his craft on another long-running show, and he came away from it with a firm belief about endings. He had watched a series he loved stretch on past its natural life until it sagged and lost its spark, and he swore he would never let that happen to his own. So he made a hard choice that few shows ever make. He chose to end Breaking Bad while it was still strong, rather than milk it for as long as people would keep watching. That single decision, to stop on purpose at the right time, shaped the tight, deliberate feel of the whole show. The team around him matched that same steadiness. A small group of writers worked together in one room, season after season, building the story piece by piece. Many of them stayed for years, growing into the world until they knew it as deeply as the man who made it. One of them, Moira Wally Beckett, won the show's top writing prize for that towering peak episode. And another, Peter Gould, would later help build the next great show set in the same world. This was a deep, settled, trusted group of people, not a revolving door of strangers passing through. How that room worked is the key to everything else. They did not simply make up each episode as it came and hope the pieces would fit. They worked out where the story needed to end up, then built backward from there, planting the seeds early so they could be harvested much later. That patient, careful method is only ever possible when one steady team holds the whole plan in mind at once. The buried clues, the long payoffs, the slow fall of a single man, all of it came out of a room that had both the freedom to invent and the discipline to plan. And that freedom is the part that matters most of all. The team answered to no real history, no record, no living witness anywhere. Their only boss was the story itself and the man steering it. If a scene served the plan better one way, they simply wrote it that way, with nothing in the world standing in their road. The center of Breaking Bad was a single invented vision, owned completely by the people building it, free to bend and shape every piece toward one clear end. The show feels whole because, behind the camera, it truly was whole. The man at the center did far more than oversee things from a distance. He wrote some of the show's most important hours himself, and stepped behind the camera to direct its first episode, and its last, the opening and the close of the whole story, along with several others. He even won a top directing prize along the way. That hands-on grip meant the vision was never just described in meetings and then handed off to others. It was carried out, scene by the same mind that dreamed it up in the first place.
Very few shows are ever held that tightly by one person from beginning to end. Narcos was put together in a very different way, and the difference runs deep. The show was created by a team of three: Chris Brancato, Carlo Bernard, and Doug Miro, and run day to day by a lead producer named Eric Newman, who steered the bigger choices. There was real skill in that group, and together they built a handsome, gripping show. But the center of Narcos was never a single invented vision the way Breaking Bad's was. The thing at the heart of the show, the thing every choice had to serve, was the true history itself. That is the deepest difference of them all. The boss of the Narcos writers' room, in a very real sense, was the past. The real events set the order of the story, the cast of characters, and the exact place where it all had to end. The makers even said as much about their own show, explaining that it was never really meant to be the tale of one man, but the much larger story of how the drug trade was born. Their job, as they saw it, was to serve that bigger, true story faithfully and well. The history led, and the writing followed behind it. Serving a true history pulls a writer's room in its own direction, and that pull shows up plainly on the screen. A room serving history spends its energy getting the events right, fitting the real people into their places, and finding a way to make a sprawling record clear enough to follow. That is honest and difficult work. But it is a different kind of work from inventing a clean-shaped story out of nothing. One room asks what really happened and how to show it. The other room asks what should happen next to serve the plan. Those two questions build two very different kinds of writing. The result is a contrast a careful watcher can feel even without knowing any of this. Breaking Bad moves like a single long thought, each piece clearly placed by a mind that always knew where it was going. Narcos moves more like a guided tour through real events, well-led and full of strong moments, yet shaped first and always by the demands of the record. One was authored, the other was arranged. Both took real skill, but only one had the freedom to bend its entire world toward a single planned end. Traced back, the behind-the-scenes setup explains nearly every strength the earlier parts praised. The planting and payoff needed one steady team holding a long plan. The buried clues needed years of continuity inside one room. The chosen, designed ending needed a single owner willing to stop the show on purpose. The control over every event needed freedom from any real record. Each of those strengths grew straight out of how Breaking Bad was built. A single vision, a settled room, and the freedom to invent. The gap on the screen was set in motion off the screen. None of this makes the Narcos way of working wrong or lazy. Serving a true history well is hard, careful, valuable work. And the show's makers did it with real talent and care. A single guiding mind is no magic formula either, since plenty of shows built around one person have fallen flat on their faces. The point is narrower than any rule about which method is better overall. The point is that the particular setup behind Breaking Bad, one inventive vision running free, was the exact setup that allowed its particular kind of greatness. Narcos was built for a very different job, and it did that job well. This is the root that lies beneath all the other roots. The freedom that has run through every part of this comparison, the freedom to invent, went deeper than the stories themselves. It was built into the very way Breaking Bad was made, with one mind free to shape an invented world toward a planned end. Narcos, by its very nature, handed that freedom over to the past, letting real history sit in the center seat. The difference in the writing was decided long before any episode ever aired, in the simple choice
of what each show would serve. There is one more sign of how much that setup truly mattered, and it shows up in what each show left behind. A vision strong enough and a room deep enough do not run dry the moment the main story ends. They keep on giving.
The same minds that built Breaking Bad were able to turn around and build more from the very same world, while the true story behind Narcos could only stretch so far before it ran out of fresh ground to cover. The richness of one and the limits of the other were both written into them from the very start. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The clearest proof of that richness came after Breaking Bad had already ended. The same guiding mind, joined by a writer from that same trusted room, went back into the world they had built and made another show. A story set before the first one that many fans and critics called just as great, and a few even call greater still. The well was that deep. The next part looks at the strange afterlife of these two shows, at what their makers were able to build once the original stories were finally done, and at what that aftermath reveals about how much real writing was there to begin with. Section 10. What grew after the story ended? The truest test of how much writing a show really holds is not how it ends. It is what its makers can grow from it once the main story is finally over. A shallow show is finished the moment its last episode airs, with nothing left in the ground to plant again. A deep one keeps on giving, because the world it built was rich enough to support whole new lives. The last part ended on the idea that one of these shows held a far deeper well than the other. What each show grew after the final credits proves that idea beyond any doubt at all. When a beloved show ends, its makers face a choice about what comes next. They can simply walk away, or they can build something new from the same world. The thing they choose to build, and how good it turns out, says a great deal about how much was really there to begin with. If the world was thin, anything built on top of it will feel thin too. A cheap grab leaning on a famous name. If the world was deep, the new thing can stand on its own 2 feet, sometimes even matching the show that came before it. Both of these shows tried to grow something new from their roots. The results could not possibly have been more different. Breaking Bad made the bolder, stranger choice by far. Rather than chase the obvious move and follow its drug kingpin around some more, the same guiding mind, joined by a trusted writer from the original room, turned instead to a small side character almost nobody would have picked. In the first show, there was a sleazy, fast-talking lawyer named Saul Goodman, a man brought in mostly for laughs, the kind of figure who lightens a dark scene and then slips away. The makers looked at that little comic character and decided to build a whole new show around him. On paper, that idea sounds thin to the point of foolish. A funny side lawyer hardly seems like the seed of great television. Yet across 6 full seasons of a show called Better Call Saul, the makers grew that flat little joke of a man into one of the richest, saddest, most fully human characters the medium has ever held. They went back to an earlier time, before the first show even began, and slowly built the story of how a hopeful, struggling man with a decent heart bent and cracked and curdled into the slick crook fans already knew. The actor, Bob Odenkirk, carried the whole sad journey. The comic relief became a tragedy. The joke became a soul. That transformation is one of the purest displays of writing skill television has ever offered. To take a character who existed only to lighten the mood, and to find inside him a deep, aching, believable life, is an act of almost pure invention.
There was no rule anywhere forcing that lawyer to have any inner life at all. The writers simply imagined one, layer by patient layer, and made it feel completely true. Only a fully invented world ever allows that. A writer can reach into any corner of it, pick the smallest figure standing there, and grow an entire human being out of a few scraps. The new show did not just survive, it soared. Critics praised it as deeply as they had praised the original, and many of them came to a surprising verdict, calling the new show just as great as the famous one that spawned it, with more than a few arguing it climbed even higher. Its scores rose season after season, reaching as high as the original ever had. It earned such a long run of the industry's top award nominations that it became famous as one of the most nominated shows in all of television history. Even as, by a strange streak of bad luck, it somehow never won a single one of them. The world of the first show had been deep enough to hold a second masterpiece. Beyond the prequel, the well gave even more. The same guiding mind, Vince Gilligan, also made a full-length film called El Camino, set right after the first show ended, following the young partner Jesse Pinkman into the desperate hours just after his escape, closing out a tale fans had ached to see finished. One world, and from it grew a 6-season prequel many call a masterpiece, and a film that gave a beloved character his proper ending. The same minds kept reaching into the same invented ground and kept pulling up gold. The story behind it all seemed to have no bottom anywhere. Narcos also kept going after its main tale was told, and it did so with real skill. Once Escobar was dead and the story of his city had run its course, the makers moved the whole show to a different country, turning to the rise of the drug trade in Mexico in a series called Narcos, Mexico. They brought in new villains and new agents, including a charming, dangerous kingpin, played by Diego Luna, and the brave agent hunting him, played by Michael Peña. And they told that new chapter with the same handsome, gripping style as before. The show carried on, and it carried on well. The difference lies in the shape of the growth. Breaking Bad grew inward and downward, reaching into its own world to deepen a character who was already standing there, digging until it struck something profound. Narcos grew sideways, moving to a fresh country and a fresh, true story to keep the same kind of tale going. It did not deepen an old character into something richer. It found a new, real history and dressed it up in the same way as before. The growth spread wide while staying shallow. And the reason for that traces straight back to the cage. Narcos could not have done what Breaking Bad did, even if it had wanted to with all its heart. A true story cannot reach into a small character and invent a deep, secret life for him, because that life would be a flat lie about a real person. The writers cannot simply decide that some minor figure from the real history secretly carried a rich, tragic inner journey, and then build a whole show out of it, without leaving the truth behind entirely. The only honest way for Narcos to grow was to go and find another true story somewhere else. So that is exactly what it did, moving to a new place with a new, real cast. The two afterlives feel completely different because of this. Breaking Bad's world turned out to be a deep mine, and its makers kept descending into it to find new treasure in places no one would have expected. Narcos' world was more like a long road, and its makers kept driving it onward to new towns, each one fresh but built to the very same plan. One afterlife was a discovery. The other was a continuation. Both gave fans more to watch and enjoy, yet only one revealed hidden depth that had been quietly waiting inside the original all along. To be fair, the new Narcos was genuinely good, and some viewers and critics liked it even more than the original. Its lead villain was charming and frightening. Its new agent was easy to root for.
and its scores landed comfortably in the strong, well-liked range. The makers had clearly grown sharper at their craft over the years. There is no shame at all in a continuation done well, and this one was done well. Not every show needs to dig a deep mine into itself. Driving the road onward to new towns is a perfectly honest way to keep a good story alive. Even so, the ceiling that has shadowed Narcos all along held firm once again. The new show stayed inside the same band of good, strong, enjoyable television, the kind people happily recommend to a friend, without ever climbing into the rare air that the original Breaking Bad reached, and that the prequel reached right alongside it. It earned some notice at award shows, mostly the kind aimed at international and technical work, but it never once broke into the top tier of writing prizes. The same wall stood in the very same place. Good, solid, watchable, and held back by the same cage as ever. The single clearest proof in this whole comparison might just be that small lawyer. The gap it reveals is enormous. One show was free enough and deep enough to take a throwaway comic figure and spend 6 seasons turning him into a heartbreaking, fully alive human being, building a second great show on a character the first show had barely needed at all. The other show, for all its real skill, could not deepen a single one of its true figures in that way, because the truth simply would not let it. The freedom to invent let one show find a masterpiece hiding inside a joke. The duty to the truth left the other reaching for fresh ground instead. One more fair point about the awards belongs here. The prequel, for all its towering praise, became famous for that strange streak of bad luck, earning its long run of top nominations while somehow never winning even one. That alone shows that awards carry plenty of noise and unfairness, and that a snub proves little about quality. The new Narcos earning some honors while the prequel earned none, taken on its own, would mean almost nothing at all. The real proof lives somewhere else entirely, in the kind of thing each show was able to grow in the first place. This is the freedom argument told one final way. An invented world can grow inward forever, because a writer can always reach into it and build a new life from nothing, deepening any corner that happens to catch the eye. A true story can only grow outward, hunting for the next set of real events, because its existing people are sealed shut by the record and cannot be opened up and remade. Breaking Bad grew inward and struck a second masterpiece. Narcos grew outward and found another solid season of the same. The afterlife of each show was decided by the same old difference: the blank page set against the true story. A quiet truth hides in all of this, fitting for a comparison about writing. The richest thing Breaking Bad ever proved about itself, it proved only after it had already ended. The fact that a tiny side character could carry a whole second great show showed, in the clearest way imaginable, just how much careful life had been built into every corner of that world. Even the corners nobody was watching. A shallow show has nothing waiting in its dark corners. Breaking Bad had a full masterpiece hiding in one of its smallest ones. Narcos' afterlife tells its own honest story, and it is not a sad one. It says that the makers had a reliable, well-built way of turning true history into gripping television, and that they could carry that method to new places and make it work all over again. That is a real and useful skill, and the world is better off for the stories it brought to light. But it also says that the method had a fixed ceiling, that it could spread to new ground without ever reaching new heights, because the thing holding it down was built into its very nature. The afterlife confirmed the limit, rather than breaking through it. With the two afterlives set side by side,
The whole argument of this comparison stands complete. One show, free and invented and steered by a single deep vision, kept proving it had more to give long after it should have run dry.
The other, skilled but tied to the truth, kept proving it could do its one good trick again in a brand new place. Depth against breadth. A mine against a road. The blank page against the record, one last time, with the very same result it has given every single time before. All of this, the control, the planting, the showing, the chosen ending, the towering peak hour, the cost of truth, the steady vision, and the bottomless afterlife, points toward one last question that sits underneath everything else. A show can be better built, better judged, and better able to grow, and still the deepest question of all remains. What is each show actually about, down at its very core? And which kind of meaning lasts longer in the mind? Breaking Bad and Narcos were both, on the surface, simply shows about the drug trade. But great writing always reaches for something larger than its plot. Some truth about people that outlives the story carrying it. One of these shows planted an idea about human nature itself. An idea that keeps quietly growing in the mind long after the screen goes dark. The other taught a powerful chapter of real history that ends, more or less, right where the history itself ends. The next part digs into what each show was truly trying to say beneath all the crime and the chaos, and why one of those messages reaches far past the screen, while the other stays rooted in a single true tale. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.